Hello and welcome to the Liverpool.com podcast. I'm James Martin, joined today by Matt Addison, and we're going to be completing the set of the sort of assessment of the Liverpool squad ahead of pre-season proper. We are underway now, but of course haven't had any of the pre-season games yet. But yeah, we've done the attack for you, we've done the defence, and now we'll be casting our eye over the midfield. But before we dive into that, the usual message from NordVPN. To get the best discount off your NordVPN plan, go to nordvpn.com/bloodred. Our link will also give you 4 extra months on the 2-year plan. There's no risk with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee, and you should be able to find that link in the podcast episode description box. Right, onto that midfield then, Matt. It's possibly not the most discussed position. I suppose we've sort of hinted at that by tackling the defence and attack first. But the midfield, maybe it's being overlooked. Maybe we should be talking about it a little bit more, because despite the fact that the whole of last summer was dedicated to that sort of midfield overhaul, you sort of fast forward a year and there's still quite a lot of questions to be asked. I suppose primarily around that number 6 position. Of course, Wataru Endo came in last summer. I think we're all sort of considering him more of a stopgap, given his age, given his profile. He did do very well last season, but one of those first questions for Slot and for Richard Hughes as well will be whether Liverpool wants to buy in that role, won't it?
Yeah, I think to a certain extent that is true. My own personal stance and the way that I think and suspect that Liverpool will probably look at it as well is that, yes, it's a position that could be improved and there could be a long-term solution out there. But also there's a couple of question marks, really. I think Endo did a lot better than probably what everybody expected, probably himself included, last season in terms of not just the performances and the levels that he reached, but also the amount of games that he played. There's probably a little bit of a question mark, given he's a year older. He's coming off the back of a season where he's never had to be under that much physical pressure in terms of his body having to cope with that volume of games. He's never had to do that before. I think there's maybe a little bit of a question mark about what the overhang, if you like, might be from last season to the next season. I think there's a bit of a question there. Obviously, we're not quite sure where Stefan Bajcetic is up to. Back fit and ready and has played games for the 21s, but I think Liverpool are going to have to be careful with him and not sort of overplay him as well, partly because of the age, partly because he's just spent a year on the sidelines. And I'm a bigger fan of Alexis Mac Allister in the 6 than a lot of people are, but I think a lot of people will have questions around that as well. So there's definitely questions. The biggest question, though, for me is there a world-class option out there? I don't think it's worth going out and just getting somebody for the sake of it. That's not something that Liverpool would ever do, but I don't think that just getting somebody for another slightly improved stopgap, short-term, medium-term option is really the way to go. I think Liverpool clearly have tried to get a world-class number 6 2 or 3 times. It hasn't happened. That's why they were prepared to spend as much as what they bid for Moises Caicedo, because there is such a dearth of those options. The biggest thing for me really is there an option out there? Probably not. Therefore, I think Liverpool probably will stick with what they have. That will worry some people, but I'm not massively worried by it, because as we've talked about loads of times on this podcast, I do quite like Alexis Mac Allister there for 95% of the Liverpool matches, and it allows me to get 1 or 2 more of the players that I like a little bit further up the pitch as well. So for me, it's not a major issue. It would be nice rather than an absolute necessity, I think, to go and get a number 6 this summer.
Yeah, that's fair enough. We'll talk a bit more about Mac Allister and his role as the episode goes on, I'm sure, because that is almost the crux of the midfield debate. If you see him as that number 6, then suddenly things do get a bit easier further forward, as you say. But the question marks over whether that's the sort of foundation, if you like, to build the title challenging team on. Certainly it's a different foundation to what we've seen in the past with a destroyer like Fabinho, but not necessarily a foundation that doesn't work. Obviously, Liverpool went close to the distance last season and did win silverware with Mac Allister in that number 6 role. So certainly a debate that can be had, and one that we will have. But in terms of, like you say, the options on the market, there are, again, issues. There's maybe been 1 or 2 kicking about in the last 2 summers, as you mentioned. Caicedo, Liverpool almost reacted a bit late to it, and I suppose that's maybe the hangover of the sort of sporting director situation. Jörg Schmadtke came in, relatively late in the day, taking over from Julian Ward, and we knew as well that would be a temporary solution. And maybe by the time Liverpool were on the scene, Chelsea had already put in that groundwork behind the scenes. We've also mentioned before that he's a boyhood Chelsea fan, so not too much to read into the fact that they missed out, but it did mean that kind of one option they would have sanctioned that spend on was not available. You rewind to the previous summer, we saw similar with Aurelien Tchouameni. Again, not one to read into too much, because Real Madrid do seem to just have this almost unique pulling power over more or less anyone. I think most clubs would have lost out in that situation, again, as we've touched upon before. But yeah, I suppose this summer you're looking around, is there anyone in that bracket? I know you said maybe not, but we'll have to mention the one sort of name in that position who has been linked with a degree of persistence, and that would be João Neves from Benfica. We've seen him a little bit with Portugal at the Euros. He hasn't been necessarily starting all of those games, but we've seen flashes of him that we may not have seen as much of him before. But I suppose with the price tag being put on him, I think his release clause is just a shade over £100 million. That's the case of it's a price on his potential rather than where he is now. I'm not expecting you'll have seen a ton of him, but do you think that no one's seen enough of him to be sort of justifying that kind of spend at this point?
Yeah, pretty much. A good player, but 19 years of age. I don't think Liverpool are going to go anywhere near his release clause. I don't think anybody is. I think that's probably the reason that he's got that release clause in the first place, really, is that he will stay there for a while. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's at least 3 years, possibly 4 years still left to run on that deal. It is one that is going to be there. He will make the move, I think, at some point, but he feels like a player that Liverpool would probably buy him when he was 22 or 23, and it might cost them a little bit more, but they would rather do that. I mean, I say it would cost them a bit more. It can't really cost them much more than his release clause at the moment, but it feels like one that you'd have to wait and see, really. Liverpool would almost certainly want it to be a bit more of a sure thing, no matter the cost, but certainly when you're talking about those numbers, I think there's been a couple of stories in Portugal today that they might consider sort of 20 million euros less than his release clause, but that's still an absolutely enormous. I think Liverpool, it would be a club record even at that price for Liverpool. So yeah, I think that's pretty unlikely. There's been other players who've been linked as well. I think probably João Palhinha is one that I would have looked at a couple of years ago when he moved to Fulham. That possibly would have been one that ticked a few boxes at the time, but then obviously he's gone to Bayern for a fairly substantial fee. He's that little bit older now as well, so there's that kind of goes against him. So that's the thing, really. You look around and there's no obvious options. I know a lot of people were completely set on Manuel Ugarte, who went to PSG last season, but they spent, I can't remember exactly how much, but it was 50-60 million. It was a substantial amount of money, and hasn't really settled there. Could be available again this summer. It's difficult though, because it's hard to know what you want from that defensive midfield position. I think Ugarte and Palhinha are very much hard tackling players who maybe are not particularly good on the ball. Maybe Alexis McAllister is the reverse of that, where he's very, very good on the ball, but maybe less in terms of the defensive awareness and positioning. Even though I think for a lot of last season, the role, he did kind of get used to it and got up to a level. There were sporadic games where it was a complete mess. I think it was Wolves away, wasn't it, where he was particularly poor and gets took off at half time, and people remember that. But obviously that was partly jet lag and all the rest of it. So even that, I think there were mitigating circumstances. So it's hard to get a player, is the bottom line, that ultimately will tick all of those boxes. I think if there was a player out there, Liverpool would have the money to do it. I'm not even convinced that Moises Caicedo would have been perfect for Liverpool had they got that deal done, given what he's done at Chelsea. I think he probably would have been better, but to justify what would have been 111 million, I think it was, that the Liverpool bid for him, I don't know. It's tricky, really, to pinpoint any names. I think with almost any name that you could throw at me, I can probably throw back 5 reasons why it might not happen.
Yeah, so let's stick to the names already in the Liverpool squad then, because there are some interesting ones. One release clause that, of course, was triggered was that of Dominic Szoboszlai last summer. Had a electric start, I think it's fair to say. People were They were giving him Gerrard shouts before he even kicked a ball, and then after a month or two, they were actually looking like they were justified. He was absolutely incredible. But then, fair to say that he went off the boil to such an extent that by the end of the campaign, he was mostly sitting the games out on the bench. It's maybe one who he won't be glad to see Jurgen Klopp leave, of course, but potentially one who could benefit from that fresh start under Arne Slot. Do you think there's a challenge for him to win that place back, or do you think, come the start of the season, he'll be back a bit earlier than some others with Hungary out relatively early in the Euros? Do you think it'll be his place to lose again come kick-off of the season?
Yeah, I mean, I would say Harvey Elliott has probably got the shirt at the moment. I think he's ended the season really well, probably in Liverpool's player of the season conversation, really, even though a lot of those appearances were off the bench rather than from the start. I think across the course of the season, he was considerably better than Szoboszlai. Obviously, he had the first half of the season where he was very good, but then tailed off. And I think my worry with him really is physical rather than anything else. I think he's clearly a very good player, technically excellent, can shoot from distance, clearly very, good in terms of the stuff he does on the ball, but the off the ball stuff is where you really sort of see him come to the fore. Obviously, with the Leipzig background and the way that he's come in, and you kind of seen certainly at the first part of the season and in certain games towards the end of the season as well, he's clearly physically very, very good, very fast and strong and perfect for what you want in that Liverpool midfield in terms of the pressing and all of that kind of thing. But I think that's the worry for me, really, is that he just looked absolutely exhausted for most of the second half of last season. I think he looked pretty tired during the Euros as well. He wasn't his usual self. I think it's fair to say he wasn't at his absolute peak. Obviously, you get a little bit of a holiday, but it's not a massive amount of time, really, before he'll be back. And obviously, pre-season starts and you get back into it. So I think the first few weeks, we will know what we're getting with Dominic Szoboszlai. I think if he comes back and he looks refreshed and looks energised, then that's very, very good news. If he looks similar to how he did at the European Championship and the last few months, I think that would be a bit of a concern, really. And I suppose that only makes the case even stronger, really, for Harvey Elliott getting a bit of a run. He's obviously been back since the first day of pre-season. He's not had a tournament this summer, which I think he was pretty unlucky to miss out on. He ends the season really, really strongly, and he hasn't played as many minutes across the last sort of 12 months or so as Szoboszlai has. So I think for me, if I had to pick a midfield three, Harvey Elliott would probably be in there ahead of Szoboszlai. But again, a familiar theme of this podcast, there's going to be loads of matches next season. So there will be, obviously, chances and more than enough minutes for both of them.
Yeah, and I suppose the question being, if Harvey Elliott has one of those places locked down, who's going to be alongside him? We know that you aren't necessarily advocating for Alexis McAllister, who you'll have a bit deeper in your sort of ideal setup. So that does leave an extra spot, and there are a number of candidates. Would Curtis Jones be someone who falls into that similar category as Elliott, in that he was, unlucky to just about miss out on that place in the final England Cup? Should get a good pre-season, a proper pre-season under Slot, and then can maybe try and kick on with the shirt in his possession at the start of the campaign.
Yeah, the only question mark with Curtis Jones really for me is his injuries. He does tend to get a little knock here and there, and that's something that hopefully he can kind of grow out of and not have in the future. But I think for me, there's absolutely no doubt that he's the best left number 8 option that Liverpool have, obviously alongside Alexis McAllister. But if you can get both of them in the team at the same time, I think that gives Liverpool loads and loads of control. And I think that's basically the way that you help out McAllister. The way that I can justify McAllister being the 6 is that if you've got, Curtis Jones alongside him who can help win the ball back, but also just keep the ball and put his foot on it sometimes. I know some people do get annoyed with him taking too many touches and maybe holding on to it a little bit too long at certain points. But for me, that's 2 out of the 3 midfielders have to be them for Liverpool to be at their best. I think the best game that they played last season was Aston Villa at home, when they were just completely dominant against a team that ends up in the Champions League and ends up hammering quite a lot of teams last season, and certainly on the counter-attack were really dangerous. But Liverpool on that particular occasion, it came earlier in the season when obviously everyone was fresh, but certainly Curtis Jones and Alexis McAllister were in there. I think that was when Szoboszlai was at his best, so I assume that he would have started on that right-hand side of the midfield 3 as well. But certainly 2 out of those 3, if you've got them at their peak, I think there's more than enough in terms of their on-ball qualities to kind of compensate for the stuff that they might not necessarily have in terms of putting the foot in and that kind of thing. So, yeah, for me, Curtis Jones is the one with the shirt. Ryan Gravenberch will be there as well, but I think there's a long way to go really for him to get into the team ahead of someone like Curtis Jones. I think they do have similar-ish skill sets that they can both kind of be developed in that role, but it'll be really, really interesting, I think, to see if Curtis Jones is still in that team at the start of next season. I think maybe that'll answer one or two questions. I know he was a favourite of Jurgen Klopp's, but I can definitely see the way that Arne Slot plays as well. I think he's perfectly suited really to playing in that position as well.
Yeah, Szoboszlai, I think, was the last Liverpool player to have played the full 90 minutes in the previous campaign. I think he had the first 10 games or something without Klopp subbing him off. So I think he must have been the third one in for that one. But yeah, it's a good point in terms of Jones, probably his case to start being helped by McAllister being the sixth, not only because there's that extra slot, but as you say, because they can sort of interchange it. And it was interesting, wasn't it, in the opening press conference for Arne Slot where he talked about formation, and of course you'll have been feeling very smug on that because you've been telling us all for weeks and weeks that it's not in fact a 4-2-3-1 that he's really been playing with at Feyenoord. It's much more fluid than that. He basically gave the same word-for-word answer there. And I suppose when you look at McAllister and Jones when Liverpool are out of possession, you do get that sort of almost 4-2-3-1-ish shape with those two going into that double pivot, someone else in front of them, and you can see how the 4-3-3 can quickly start to look like that 4-2-3-1. So, yeah, it's all about being compact. We know that's been Liverpool's struggle in midfield for almost as long as you can remember, really. It's how do you get all of this attacking talent in without just leaving this gaping hole for teams to counter-attack through. I think, as you say, Aston Villa is almost that sort of pinnacle, that thing to aim for. And yeah, maybe that is the personnel to do it. But yeah, I think you're right about Gravenberch being a similar player as well. You look at things like FB Ref, where they have their similar players tool, and you look at this. There's this cluster of Liverpool players who are similar to each other. Interestingly, most of them seem to be similar in some respects to Jude Bellingham as well. Obviously, not quite as good, but you see Liverpool missing out on Bellingham last summer, and then you see those clusters of players basically, recreating him in the aggregate, as the famous Moneyball quote goes. It's apropos of nothing really, but interesting to see that they all do share those kind of similar-ish traits, and I suppose that does make it harder to work out who goes where, because it really is just a pretty old-fashioned battle for the shirt. It's who can train best, who can play best when they get the chances, because these players can be subbed in and out almost at will. And I think, as you say, there's enough games that we will see all of them feature to some extent or another. But I suppose when you do have that many players competing for a limited number of spots, it could even be one spot if Slot decides he prefers McAllister further forward, which I think is very much a possibility. If there then a case that you look at Harvey Elliott and think, can we move him to the wing? We know that Klopp sort of used it a bit more last season. He'd seemed more or less against it. He'd seemed pretty committed to the midfield experiment, but then we did see him popping up on that right-hand side. Certainly sort of within games, he would switch there a bit more often, even if he wasn't necessarily starting there too much. And I only ask because when we talked about the attack, we looked at that sort of two world-class options for every position idea that you mentioned, and you can do it on the left, you can do it through the middle, and then you get to the right, and there's a bit of a gap in that depth chart below Mohamed Salah. So just purely in terms of shuffling the pieces around it and getting those world-class options everywhere, is that something you think Arne Slot will sort of at least have a look at, or do you think Elliott's future at this point is very much in midfield?
I definitely prefer him in midfield, but there is definitely, an option. It might even be one of those where you do it almost just to save Mohamed Salah's legs. If Liverpool are a couple of goals up at home, it doesn't particularly matter that Harvey Elliott isn't perfectly suited to that role. You could put him out there, and I think I'd put Dominic Szoboszlai in the same sort of category as well. I think they're both fine, obviously, for the right-sided number 8 position in this formation that we assume that Arne Slot's going to go with. But I think with both of those players, really, you could see it. I think there was a period, I can't remember which game it was now, but Szoboszlai did come on the left wing, didn't he, at one point for Liverpool at the back end of last season. I can definitely see him doing that I'd almost prefer Szoboszlai there in terms of the pace. I think he's maybe slightly more physical in terms of his speed compared to Elliott, and might be able to beat a man in that way. Obviously, right-footed compared to left, so it does change the dynamic of the attack in that sense. But I think there's loads of players really in that sort of camp of between two positions. Partly, in some senses, you want Arne Slot to come in and say to Harvey Elliott, this is your position and you're just going to play that. But I think it sort of feeds into the fluidity, the press conference that you mentioned. He talked about being tactically fluid. I think that extends beyond just the formation and the way that he sets up the midfield. I think that will be probably in terms of the players, the positions that they play, even within games, not even necessarily game to game. Like you mentioned before, McAllister, if he starts as a 6, Curtis Jones for 5 or 10 minutes might be able to slot in there, and McAllister can be unleashed for a bit and then they can swap back, or potentially help Harvey Elliott, Szoboszlai, even Curtis Jones going the other way. Jones could easily pop up on the left wing for a bit. I think that there's definitely scope within this Liverpool squad to mould players into certain different positions that we've not necessarily seen loads of them. So it's going to be fascinating, I think, to see what Slot's ideas are and the way that he wants some of these players to play. He wasn't too keen to pin down publicly, at least, a position for Trent and obviously for Cody Gakpo as well. So I don't think we'll hear too much from him in terms of where he wants these players to play. But I think there's probably 8 or 10 players that you could say maybe could be tried in a different position, or maybe will pop up in certain positions if the game dictates that's the best way of doing it. I think there's definitely a way forward, and an interesting summer, certainly, and probably the first few weeks of the season as well. There'll be a few experiments. I think obviously the nature of this summer makes it difficult to do all of that work on the training ground. So potentially we might see those players in their sort of existing positions to start with. But I think that the longer Slot has with this team, I get the feeling we might see a few more of those sort of in-game experiments, if you like.
And I suppose we do need to talk about Trent Alexander-Arnold, because that's been the topic of the summer, hasn't it? Whether his future lies in midfield. As you say, Slot would not be drawn on that in his opening press conference, but he did say he has a plan, which was to make of that what you will. We don't know what the plan is, but we can speculate wildly, as everyone else seems to be doing. We have seen him in midfield for England a little bit at the Euros. And it's been a conversation for pretty much as long as he's been in the team. I think we've seen some of the positives and negatives with England. It's not been the most comprehensive of experiments, because Southgate seemed to more or less give up on it after a game and a half. So not too many conclusions you can draw. But I suppose anytime someone moves, a space opens up somewhere else. So if that 6 was to go to Trent Alexander-Arnold, then you can move McAllister further forward, which I know some people like. And then at right back, there's maybe more of a pathway for Conor Bradley, who I thought had an excellent season last year. Is it something you can see Slot looking at, or do you think that this plan is hinted at is very much a kind of right back focused plan?
For me, the Trent conversation should be over now. I think certainly for this summer. Look, I like Conor Bradley, but I think Trent's a better right back than Conor Bradley is. I don't think that's a controversial statement. I've already said that I like McAllister in that 6, so then that means that, where do you play Trent? Maybe you play him on the right of the midfield 3, but then you're losing, Szoboszlai or Harvey Elliott, which I'd like to see more of both of those in that position as well. For me, though, the bottom line with it all is just, okay, the England experiment, it's with England, it's with Southgate rather than a really elite coach. There's not been loads of time for him to practice. There's lots of mitigations around why it hasn't worked for England, but it's not really about that for me. I think this summer there's not a great deal of turnaround. If England go out on Wednesday, or whether they go through to the final of the Euros, Trent's not going to be there for a few weeks. There's not going to be that long between when he comes back for pre-season and when the new season starts. And I think what we have seen with England definitively is that you can't just learn a position overnight. Whether he could be a better midfielder with time, or whether this is just his level in the midfield and it hasn't quite worked as people thought and it wasn't quite as good an idea or not. You can argue that for ages, but I think what we've learned definitively is that you can't just throw him in there and say, right, get on with it. It's not just for him as well, it's for the other players around him to learn. It wouldn't just be a change for him, it would be different in the midfield for McAllister, for example. It would be different in the attack. Mohamed Salah would probably have to take up a slightly different position. It's a lot to learn and it's a lot to take on board, I think, in terms of one summer. When you're already changing the head coach, you're already bringing in a completely new backroom team, you're already probably making a few changes in terms of the way that Liverpool play between the two regimes. I think it's just too much for Arne Slot and Liverpool to think about this summer. So I'd be very surprised if they moved Trent away from what he was doing. I think the question really is, does he sort of go back to being a more, not a traditional right back, because he clearly wasn't ever that kind of, defensively solid and sort of functional player. He was very much a playmaker from fullback. But the question mark is, does he go back to being wide, or does he carry on doing the hybrid thing? I think that's basically the question for me. The midfield thing, I just don't think there's enough time to sort that out this summer.
Yeah, I think possibly if there wasn't McAllister in that conversation already, then it might be a bit more of an interesting one, because I think a lot of the strength that McAllister has as the number 6, the reasons you like him there, with that sort of playmaking function he can bring from deep, that vision, that progression, I think that's what Trent offers you when you do play him as the deepest midfielder. But then you have that same trade-off that we've talked about with McAllister in terms of, the defensive side of things. I'm sure some would argue, when he spent his whole career at right back being questioned defensively, often not correctly, but those questions have been asked. Does it really make that much sense to move him into defensive midfield to then try and get the best out of him? There's certainly question marks over the logic there. So it would have to be more of that deep line playmaker role. And as you've made the case for quite convincingly, McAllister does that very well. So I think you're right. When it's a case of what happens with the hybrid role, for me, I think I might be leaning towards that more traditional role, as you say, not super traditional, but you look at Trent's numbers, and of course you can't be too simplistic. There are lots of other factors at play, but you look at those seasons where he was, breaking the assist record for and 2 seasons in a row over double figures in those assist charts, and that was when it was a pretty straightforward blueprint in a way. He was getting forward from wide, he was putting crosses in the box, and he's always come in field to a certain extent. He's never been limited by the label of right back, but even though he has contributed in other ways, I'm yet to be particularly convinced that he's been a more effective player for Liverpool since the hybrid experiment began. It's such a tricky question, because every change that's been made has been made with the intention of making the absolute most of what is clearly, quite a generational talent that Liverpool has on its hands, that England has on its hands. But it's just yet to really become apparent what the definitive right answer is, if indeed there is one. So, yeah, I suppose before we move on from Trent, I know you raised the question, but I'll make you answer it as well, in terms of what do you reckon? Have we seen sort of the end of the hybrid role, or do you think that's still the best way of getting the most out of him?
For me, it became apparent really in the second half of last season. I've always been intrigued by the hybrid thing. I don't think Liverpool should be copying Manchester City and Arsenal, but I do think it's telling that they've used that to some success. Liverpool have got a player who is considerably more talented than the players that they've tried in that role, so I think it makes sense to have given it a go. But to me, it doesn't make sense to nail your colours to either of those two things. I think you've almost got to say to Trent that he has even more of a free role, in that just go where the space is, and that's where he's going to be most effective. I think there were certain times last season, I think I've mentioned it on here before, the Fulham game, it was just really noticeable. He was sort of 20, 30 yards in front of where I was sat, and you could see that all of the Fulham plan was around getting 4 or 5 players. Alex Iwobi basically man-marked him in the middle. Every time he had the ball, there was players in a circle basically around him to stop that. Whereas out wide, you had, I think it was Jarell Quansah on that particular occasion, in acres of space. And to me, that the hybrid role in that sense doesn't make any sense. If Trent's in the middle and loads of opposition bodies are in the middle, then the space is out wide. It almost, I just think you've got to be a little bit more fluid with it. I'm not saying that you never do the hybrid thing. I'm not saying you go 100% back to going sort of traditional and staying out wide. I think he's almost got to be trusted within that game to just spot what the opposition plan is, maybe work around that. Maybe if there's a little bit of a gap that opens up where he can receive the ball in a completely different position, maybe it's a little bit higher up, maybe it's between the centre-backs that we saw once or twice last season. I think he's got the intelligence as a footballer to be able to do that. But basically my answer is always going to change. It depends what the opposition do. It depends in that particular moment what that game needs. The only thing that I want to see from Trent, whether it's in the middle or out wide, is just have the ball in a little bit of space, because as soon as you find that space, he's got the range of passing to be able to make the most of it. So that's not really an answer one way or the other, but that's basically my answer is I want to see him wherever that space is, and that does change. It might change within a game. It might change week to week. It doesn't really matter for me where he picks the ball up. The rest of the team are just going to have to deal with that. Give him the ball in space, and that's where he's going to be devastating.
Well, we did pretty well. We got about 20, 25 minutes in before it descended into a Trent discussion about the midfield. So I think that's pretty good going, and hopefully it's been enjoyable. Obviously, leave your comments in terms of what you'd like to see, in terms of what you'd like to see Slot do with Trent, with McAllister, and with anyone else we've talked about, and even players we haven't talked about. Of course, Tyler Morton coming back from loan. He's pretty highly thought of as well. There's been talk of another loan away or even a permanent move to the Bundesliga, to Leipzig. Liverpool didn't seem keen on a loan with an option to buy, so that's one to watch as well. But we've had a pretty comprehensive discussion of the sort of senior options at Slot's disposal, and we'll be sure to look with interest in terms of what shape is sort of being taken up as pre-season gets properly underway, and then when the campaign itself starts. Certainly one to watch, and we'll keep you up to date as well with any transfer developments. We'll have our Transfer Live blog, which is going every day over on Liverpool.com, and we'll have plenty of other analysis and news as well. So be sure to check out all of the content on Liverpool.com. Be sure to check out all of the content on Blood Red as well. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching.